On April 14, 1865, at Ford's Theater in the capital of Washington, a dry click rang out, freezing the room. The Derringer pistol in John Wilkes Booth's hand had jammed. The assassin was stunned for a fateful tenth of a second, and that was enough for Major Rathbone to lunge forward and tackle him to the wooden floor. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States of America, startled and turned around, his gaunt, wrinkled face not yet comprehending what had just happened. He had survived. History has always taught us that Lincoln's death at Ford's Theater was an irreparable tragedy, a knife tearing through the soul of America just as the Civil War had drawn to a close. But what if I told you that Lincoln walking out of that theater unscathed that night could have ignited a second Civil War just as devastating, one not fought on the bloody battlefield of Gettysburg but right inside the Capitol? What if I told you that the great father of America, who had just defeated the Southern Confederacy, could very well have ended his term in abandonment, ultimate division, and even faced the threat of impeachment by his closest allies? History is not a straight, rosy path, and a post-war America molded by a living Lincoln would be a canvas filled with dark, gloomy colors, sinister political plots, and shocking truths that today's textbooks rarely mention. Let's step into an alternate timeline where the bullet never left the barrel, to witness a Reconstruction era that is raw, fierce, and entirely different. To understand the storm about to crash down on Lincoln, we must strip away the divine halo that posterity has draped over him. Lincoln was great, but he was not a king with absolute power. He was a politician walking a tightrope across a nation divided to its very roots. Even on the joyous day of victory, the inner circle of the Washington administration was fractured into factions ready to tear each other apart. The radical Republicans, led by powerful figures like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, were thirsty for blood. They viewed the American South not as wayward brothers needing to be welcomed back, but as defeated territories that must be ruthlessly punished. They wanted to hang the plantation elite, confiscate all Confederate wealth, and immediately grant voting rights to all newly freed black people. But Lincoln held a completely opposing vision. In his second inaugural address, he stated, "With malice toward none, with charity for all." Lincoln proposed the extremely lenient 10% plan. If only 10% of the voters in a southern state swore loyalty to the Union, that state would have its government restored and its membership reinstated. He was prepared to pardon almost everyone who had sided with the South. This leniency from Lincoln was not out of weakness, but because he understood that forcing millions of Southerners, who were filled with hatred, into a framework of cruel punishment would only spawn an endless underground insurgency. However, in the eyes of the radicals, Lincoln's tolerance was a blatant betrayal of the blood of hundreds of thousands of Northern soldiers who had fallen. If Lincoln had survived that fateful night, his first months would not have been a honeymoon of peace, but a fiery clash with his own Congress. Unlike his successor Andrew Johnson, who was crude and lacked political skill, Lincoln was a master of the art of persuasion and political manipulation. But the pressure from the radicals would be colossal. Imagine Lincoln having to use every political maneuver, from threatening vetoes to offering bribes in the form of cabinet positions, just to prevent Congress from passing laws punishing the South. This division would erode his image. There would be newspapers in the North calling him a coward, a protector of Southern traitors. Furthermore, a constitutional crisis could erupt if Congress was determined to reject the state governments that Lincoln had personally sponsored to be established in the South. Most likely, to preserve the fragile unity of the Republican Party, Lincoln would be forced to step back and accept a harsher version of Reconstruction than he desired, though still much more moderate than the worst-case scenario. This compromise would be a bitter pill he had to swallow to maintain executive power. And this is where we touch upon one of the most controversial historical truths that has the potential to spark explosive debates: Lincoln's actual views on race and the rights of black people. Today, we revere him as the great emancipator, but Lincoln's ideology on race was far more complex than a marble monument. Throughout his political career, and even in the early years of the Civil War, Lincoln strongly supported colonization plans. He genuinely believed for a long time that white and black people could not live peacefully together in the same nation on an equal basis due to deeply rooted prejudices. His plan was to use federal funds to relocate freed black people back to Africa, specifically Liberia, or to Central America and the Caribbean. If Lincoln had remained in power, would he have revived this large-scale colonization project? The truth is that towards the end of his life, his views gradually became more progressive thanks to the contributions of black soldiers in the Union Army. In his final public speech before being assassinated, he for the first time advocated for voting rights for some black men, particularly the very intelligent and those who had served in the military. If he had lived, Lincoln would not have immediately granted universal suffrage to black people as the radicals desired. He would have chosen a path of gradual evolution, forcing Southern states to expand voting rights in phases. This slow and calculated move would have frustrated and outraged contemporary black civil rights leaders like Frederick Douglass, but Lincoln believed it was the only way to ensure white Southerners didn't feel abruptly stripped of their power, thereby minimizing the risk of bloody violence. But despite Lincoln's caution, violence was inevitable. The collapse of the slave-based economy left a massive vacuum of power and wealth in the South. Under the historically infamous President Andrew Johnson, the government returned most of the confiscated land to the former plantation owners, pushing millions of newly freed black people into poverty and forcing them to become sharecroppers under exploitative contracts no different from a new form of slavery. However, if Lincoln had been sitting in the Oval Office, the fate of the South might have taken a completely different turn thanks to the agency known as the Freedmen's Bureau. Lincoln was the one who signed the law creating this agency, and with his supreme authority, he might have protected General Sherman's Special Field Orders No. 15. This order was famous for its promise of providing 40 acres and a mule to each freed slave family from the confiscated Confederate lands. If Lincoln had resolutely used the military to defend this historic redistribution of wealth, America would have witnessed a true economic revolution. Hundreds of thousands of small farms owned by black people would have sprouted across the South. This economic autonomy would have created a robust black middle class right from the late 19th century, a solid foundation for them to defend their political rights without having to rely on the pity of white people. But this very financial independence would be the spark to ignite an unprecedented frenzy of rage. Actual data from modern economic studies points to a grim rule: wherever the Freedmen's Bureau operated most effectively, wherever black people accumulated the most wealth, racial violence erupted the most fiercely. The displaced white elites and impoverished whites, those who had just lost their only privilege, the superiority of their skin color, would not sit idly by watching the social order be overturned. History witnessed the birth of the Ku Klux Klan in 1865, but in a world where Lincoln was aggressively distributing land and granting rights, this organization would not merely stop at isolated threats or terrorism. It would transform into an armed insurgent force, a true guerrilla army waging an asymmetrical war against the federal government. Lynchings, the burning of schools, and the assassinations of black political leaders would multiply exponentially. America would witness horrifying scenes as the underground army of white extremists clashed directly with the newly armed and trained black militias. Faced with this crisis, how would Lincoln react? This is when the true mettle of a wartime president would be revealed. Unlike Andrew Johnson's blind eye intolerance, or Ulysses S. Grant's somewhat belated intervention later on, Lincoln had already proven he was willing to bend the Constitution to save the Union when he suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War. Undoubtedly, he would not hesitate to impose martial law once again across the entire South. Federal cavalry units would be densely deployed, military tribunals would replace civilian courts to try hate crimes with swift death sentences without the need for a local jury. The American South under Lincoln's rule in the years following 1865 might resemble a permanently occupied zone, where democracy was temporarily suspended to make way for the barrels of the military's guns in order to maintain order. This would push Lincoln into a painful paradox: to protect the freedom and lives of the new black citizens, the greatest president of the American democracy had to rule like a military dictator. This absolute power would make even his supporters in the North shudder with fear over a dangerous precedent for the Republic. Despite the political fractures and the smoke and fire of violence, Lincoln's brilliant strategic mind would ultimately reshape the nation's entire legal framework. Instead of leaving Congress alone to struggle with the amendments as in actual history, Lincoln would use the massive political capital of the man who had just saved America to push through the passage of the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal citizenship under the law, and the 15th Amendment, granting voting rights to men regardless of race. But the core difference lies in the enforcement. Lincoln, with his far-reaching vision, would embed much tighter federal protection mechanisms into the law to prevent southern states from finding loopholes through literacy tests or poll taxes, the sophisticated tools that later created the dark era of Jim Crow. If Lincoln lived and maintained a strong administration through his second term ending in 1869, he would have established a legal and economic system that his successors could not easily dismantle. And now, let's cast our gaze further to see the greatest butterfly effect of all if Lincoln had not died. Entering the 20th century, an America where millions of black people owned land and were protected by arms from the very beginning would be an America completely alien to us. The plantation economy reliant on exploited sharecroppers would be replaced by true free market competition. Southern states would be forced to industrialize earlier instead of wallowing in backwardness. The infamous, separate but equal, legal decision in the Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 would likely never have been handed down, because the black power structure in Congress would have been consolidated far too strongly to allow such a public humiliation to exist. The cruel barriers of racial segregation that divided America for centuries would have been smashed in the cradle. Imagine, when World War I broke out, instead of segregated black regiments having to fight under the command of white officers, America might have sent fully integrated divisions to the trenches in Europe, demonstrating an unbreakable power of unity. Even more astoundingly, the great civil rights movement of the 1960s might never have happened. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, or Rosa Parks might never have become icons of the struggle, because the fight against systemic discrimination on buses, in schools, or at diner counters would have been settled by Abraham Lincoln a century earlier. Millions of African Americans would have had access to high-quality education, accumulated multi-generational wealth, and contributed massive scientific, cultural, and political achievements to the development of the American superpower much earlier. There would be no brutal beatings on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, no tearful speeches yearning for freedom, because that dream would have been realized through ironclad laws and the protecting guns of the federal government since the 1860s. However, everything comes with a price. Crushing Southern resistance with long-term military force could create a psychological wound that would never heal for conservative white people. The smoldering hostility might not erupt into spontaneous riots, but it would secretly foster a profound ideological divide, an America constantly standing on the precipice of extreme polarization, something we can still feel even in modern politics. Lincoln saved the body of the Republic, but its soul still bore the scars he was forced to inflict in order to remove the tumor of racism. The death of Abraham Lincoln in the spring of 1865 is truly the greatest tragedy in American history. Not because he died as a martyred saint at the pinnacle of glory, but because he was robbed of his life at the exact moment America needed his genius mind, his political cunning, and his deep compassion the most to navigate the nation through a transition period filled with blood and tears. His absence left a power vacuum that made way for opportunists, the weak, and the prejudiced, plunging millions of people who had just touched freedom back into another darkness that lasted for 100 years. History is not a book that has been finished and hermetically sealed. It is a tangled web of choices, crossroads, and sometimes depends solely on whether a gun spring gets jammed or not. The story of a world where Lincoln survived reminds us that freedom and equality never come naturally, they demand ruthless protection and painful compromises. What do you think about this alternate historical scenario? Could Abraham Lincoln have truly created a just society through the might of the Federal Army, or was the deeply ingrained racial hatred of the South a monster too large for any single individual, no matter how extraordinary, to defeat? Do you agree that democracy sometimes needs to resort to martial law to protect the vulnerable? Please leave your opinions in the comments section below, because debating history is exactly how we better understand our present world. If you find yourself captivated by this journey of peeling back dark and provocative timelines, do not hesitate to hit the like button, Share the video with your fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next mind-blowing hypotheses. The YouTube algorithm is very strict, and every single interaction from you is a massive source of motivation helping us continue to decode the mysteries of the most fascinating alternate timelines. Thank you for staying with us until the final seconds. Click on the video appearing on the screen to keep immersing yourself in buried historical stories. Goodbye, and see you in our next time traveling adventures.